Thank you for joining the very first webinar of the school year. Today we are going to talk all about inclusive higher ed and what skills we can keep in mind as we start this back to school time and we prepare for college and wherever you are, your student is on that path. So with that, my name is Elise Kramer. I am the program coordinator at IN. That is my direct contact information. So at the end of this webinar, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to contact me. Tomorrow you will get a email that will have the recording to this webinar. It will also have all of these slides. So my contact information will be directly in there. Please feel free to reach out as needed. Anything goes. We have a very, very full webinar to get through today. So just to give a very, very brief welcome and thank you for being here. If you have not signed up for the rest of our webinars for the year, you can, again, access this link when I send this out tomorrow. Sign up for all of those webinars. They're all free. I have lots of Q&A time allotted throughout this hour. However, if you are someone who feels like if I wait to ask that question, I'm going to forget it, because that is me. Totally great. You can put that question in the chat at any point. If it's super pertinent and I want to answer it right away, I will. Otherwise, I may wait till that Q&A time, just sort of depending. And then at the very, very end of this, we will have a survey that will pop up on your screen. If you would take that, that'd be really great. Helps me figure out what webinars are helpful moving forward. And then lastly, as I said, you'll get all of these resources recordings tomorrow. All right. So with that, I like to give a brief overview of IN. So IN is a nonprofit that was created to support inclusive college options across the state of Colorado. We really focus on these things on the right: education, outreach, expansion, and outcomes. I say all of that to make very clear that we as a nonprofit do not provide services on campus. So I will talk about this more as we get into the meat of the webinar. But there are 8 different campuses, which means there are 8 separate service providers, if you will, and we help support all of them, but we don't provide those services directly. So just to kind of tease that out a little bit, it can get a bit convoluted. With that said, we have a very, very busy webinar today. This used to be an hour-and-a-half webinar. We heard feedback that families really prefer to only devote an hour of their evenings rather than an hour and a half. So I have done my best to condense it down as much as possible, but really and truly, this is still too much for an hour. So I'm probably going to be talking fast, skipping over some things that maybe you can review in your own time. But if there's anything I do miss that you feel like you want me to come back to, again, use that Q&A time, use that chat, and I'm always happy to provide details as necessary. So with that said, we're going to jump right in. Before we even talk about college, I think it's really helpful to understand what your students experience now in high school, and then what's going to be different in college, right? So that we kind of know what's the trajectory that we're planning for. So when we talk about what skills students need, we know why, right? When we know what expectations are different, we have some of that context to help. So this is not a full list. This is just some things that students kind of report back and say, that was really different when I went to college that I didn't expect. So to start, in high school, the law that protects special education students, the IDEA, really tries to guarantee that students have a successful educational outcome. The IDEA no longer protects students after they graduate from their public school system, which means in college it doesn't apply. So the laws that protect students with disabilities in college are the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504. And what those two things do in tandem is they make sure that students have access to college. It does not, or I should say they do not, guarantee that students are successful, right? It's kind of seen that success is a choice. It's a choice to go to class. It's a choice to go to office hours, things like that. So we'll talk about, as we go through, some of the supports that are offered to increase some of those chances of success, but it's not a guarantee. In high school, for a lot of students, the accommodation and modification process can seem pretty automatic. When I was a teacher, I would receive at the start of the school year a long list of all of the IEPs and 504s in my classroom for that year. And before I even had faces to those names, I had to know what each student got, and I had to make sure they were getting their needs met from the very moment they walked into my classroom. That's not true in college. In college, it's a very interactive process where a student has to go and they have to request those accommodations and modifications. And they have to go to their professors and they have to bring a letter saying, these are the things that have been approved, and these are the things that I need help to make sure that I get the support I need in this classroom. And if the student doesn't go to that professor and say that, they're not going to get those needs met, right? It is not automatic. In high school, we know there's a bell schedule. Students, class periods are pretty well assigned, right? There's lots of structure. As we're in college, there is so much downtime, and students have to get used to using that downtime, right? And getting used to juggling that lack of structure. In high school, not a ton of student choice, maybe a little bit. They can choose their electives, maybe they can choose their extracurriculars, but there's so much more student choice in college. Students get to choose what they want to study. Sometimes they even get to choose what days of the week they have classes, all kinds of choices that students don't get in high school. And then in high school, the parents or the guardians are the primary advocates, right? The parents and the guardians are always at meetings, talking about students' needs and things like that, right? As we're in college, parents are only there if the students invite them, and the student has to choose that they want that parent there. The student is their own primary advocate. And if they're not there to advocate for themselves, no one else is going to advocate for them, right? Again, it's part of that. Being in college is a choice. It's a choice to be there. It's a choice to advocate for yourself. And you may be thinking to yourself, I don't think my child or my student has that skill yet. That's okay. We're going to talk about how to get them there. Just a few more. In high school, there's typically a one person, one case manager who coordinates services, and that is very much not true in college. Students have a huge access to a wide variety of supports across campus, which we'll talk about on the next slide. There may be a team of people that are there to support students, particularly if they're enrolled in inclusive higher ed, but there isn't just the one person that they can always go to. So students will have to get used to knowing which office to go to for different needs. And then lastly, in high school, so much family involvement, so much guidance. As we're in college, it's really all about natural decision making and natural consequences. So in high school, you can wake your kid up and you can drive them to campus and make sure they go to class, right? That might not be true in college. If they live in a dorm, it's going to be on them to wake up and decide whether they do or do not want to go to class, right? And figuring out what are the consequences if they do or do not, right? And so a lot of that is kind of making personal decisions and figuring out what happens when we do that. And then there are so many more things that I could not possibly cover. These are just kind of the main things to get that context filled for us so that the rest of this webinar makes sense. But when I send out this slideshow tomorrow, if you click this photo here or that link, you can download a list from Think College, which is a national resource hub surrounding inclusive higher education and all things inclusive higher ed. They have this really great list that's much longer and much more in-depth than what I just shared. So I encourage you to check that out as well. And then as I mentioned on that last slide, there are tons of student supports on a college campus, right? Everything from a tutoring center to the library to the writing center and so much more. You can read that screen there. But it's really on students to figure out, right? Like if I'm sick, where do I go? I have to make my way to the health and wellness center. Or if I have mental health needs, where do I go? I know that I need to go to the counseling center. And again, there might be peer mentors or staff who can help kind of gently nudge students where to go or help them find it on campus. But ultimately, it's up to them to figure out what services will meet their individual needs because they all have needs that are very different from each other. All right, so with that said, I know that was a brief overview, but again, I think that context does matter. Let's talk about what it's like for students with disabilities to go to college in Colorado. And really, there are three kind of broad umbrella options. So if a student is a traditional student, right? They have a traditional high school diploma, they've taken their ACT or their SAT, they've been tracking their GPA all along, maybe they've been taking AP or IB classes, right? If they're eligible to go to college on a traditional route, but maybe they happen to have a disability, maybe they happen to have dyslexia or anxiety or something like that, right? So these are students that are eligible for an associate's degree, bachelor's degree, or higher, but they might need some accommodations to help make that a bit more manageable for them. So some of those accommodations might include like extra time on a test or taking assignments in a quiet room, or maybe they have a scribe, right? But ultimately, they're doing the same assignments as everybody else in class. They just have a little bit of help getting it done in a way that's going to help them be successful. The federal government requires that accommodations have to be offered by every single college and university across the United States, and those services have to be offered for free. That is only true of accommodations. As where, we're going to start talking about modifications here in a second, and we'll talk about why that might not be the case for those. So maybe you have a student who is still eligible to go to college on that traditional path, but maybe they need even more support in like independent living or executive functioning, or they need some vocational coaching, things like that. There tend to be some programs that are sometimes offered privately. They're sometimes offered on a college or a university campus. But because those services go above and beyond what the traditional disability services office will offer, they're almost always associated with a cost. There is a cost to provide the coaching, the additional things, right, that is not already provided by our tuition dollars and our federal grants and things like that. Now, if you are on this call, it's very likely that your student would not qualify on a traditional college entry path. So your student might not have an ACT score. Maybe they haven't been taking AP classes, things like that, right? So these are students who probably have an intellectual disability or other disability category that means they would need academic modification to be successful. Now, very, very briefly, we have some examples of accommodations there on that far left side, right? Things like extended time on a test. A modification is going to change the depth and the breadth of the assignments themselves to make them fit a student's cognitive understanding. So let's say a professor says you have a 5-page paper and it's due in a week. An accommodation would be you're still writing a 5-page paper, but it's due in 2 weeks. A modification might be you are not writing a 5-page paper at all. Maybe you're writing 2 paragraphs or a slideshow so that you can have lots of pictures to supplement your understanding. Or maybe you're going into your professor's office hours and you're just discussing your learning, right? And so it's all kind of verbal. So those are all examples of modifications, where it changes again the depth and the breadth of students' expected outcomes. With that said, because students are not expected to have the same complete understanding as a degree-seeking student, students who receive modifications earn a certificate credential rather than a degree credential. So if you think your student could be successful on a traditional path with additional supports, I would urge you to seek out one of these other two types of supports. As we're inclusive higher ed, students receive tons and tons and tons of support also in their academic participation, their social engagement, their vocational development, their independence. We'll talk about that as we keep going, right? Where all 4 of those are considered equally important parts of the college experience. They all get equal support. But as a result, not all schools want to provide those services, and they don't have to. They are not legally required to offer modifications or those additional supports. And as a result, if students do go through those pathways, there are pretty much always additional fees beyond the traditional tuition and fees and room and board and things like that. And the fees range based on campuses. They typically follow like, a 2-year public school is going to be cheaper than a 4-year private school, right? And so they follow kind of that traditional range of how tuition might fall as well. And that does have a backwards application process, which we'll talk about here in a few slides. But that's really kind of the bulk of what we'll chat about today, is this green box, inclusive higher ed. So, as I mentioned, there is an alternative admissions process where students who want to apply to inclusive higher ed, rather than applying to the admissions office on campus, they apply directly to the inclusive office. And if the inclusive office says that, yes, you are accepted, then the inclusive office will reach out to the admissions office and say, we're granting admission to student X, and then they will be granted admission to the university, as where a typical student would first apply to the school and then get in contact with the disability services office. So that's flipped. And the reason why is that the application requirements, the admissions requirements, are entirely different. Where a traditional student would not have to submit an IEP as part of their admission packet, inclusive higher ed students do, because they want to see what kinds of support is this student going to need on their first day on campus, right? What are their strengths? What are their needs? What are their interests? And as a result, there are lots of things that are not required. They don't necessarily have to have a high school diploma. Lots of students have a certificate of completion. Lots of students, but not all, have used EEOs, which are extended evidence outcomes, or students who are on different learning standards than the traditional Common Core standards. And all of that is fine because we expect students to have different needs and different learning experiences throughout their K-12 or K-21 experiences. They're fully inclusive and fully normative. Students in inclusive higher ed are in the same courses with the same peers and the same professors as every other student on campus. They just happen to get extra peer mentor support, right? So instead of a paraprofessional or an adult sitting in class and maybe making them feel a bit different, they have other college students who are there to help them work on group projects or help them take notes or help them study for a test after class, right? All of that is done from peers, so it's much more normative that way. The really cool thing is that students in inclusive higher ed only take courses that align with their career goals. So they get to choose what they want to do after college, and all of their courses will align with that, which is really cool. Their prereqs look a little bit different, right? They might not have to take a calculus prerequisite. Their prerequisite is going to be something like communications so that they can learn how to interact with bosses and coworkers in the workplace, right? And so it's much more geared towards directly preparing students for the workplace. As I mentioned in that last slide, students in inclusive higher ed get both accommodations and modifications, which means they get a certificate credential all along the way. They have lots of career readiness. Sometimes that's in the form of courses. Sometimes that's in the form of jobs and internships and all kinds of things in between. If they go to a campus that offers independent living, they can choose to experience that. And then, as I mentioned in that last slide, they get so much staff support, so much peer mentor support in the four main domains of academics, social development, career advancement, and independence. Or in some campuses, that looks a little bit more like independent living. Typically, I go into this slide in a lot more depth, but I am going to talk about skills as they relate to each of these four categories. So for time, I'm going to kind of skip through this. Just notice that all of those are connected by that broader black circle on the outside. All those yellow circles are that same size, right? No pillar is more important than another. Students really do receive intensive support in all four of these as needed. Some students need more support in one than another, right? And that's great. It's all kind of based on what a student needs. All right, so now to get into where in Colorado can students access inclusive higher ed? Because as I mentioned, it's not offered everywhere. So the Office of Inclusive Services, or OIS, at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. That's a traditional four-year college program. They do offer on-campus living. If students live in the Springs area, they can choose to commute as well. Their on-campus living so far has been students living in apartments for all 4 years. Beginning next year, freshmen and sophomore will live in the dorms on campus where they can get a much more traditional college living experience and then graduate into those apartments to practice a lot of those cooking, cleaning, like much more in-depth independent living skills. Arapahoe Community College has the Elevate program. That is in Littleton, Colorado. And as a community college, like most, it is a commuter campus. So lots of students take the bus, the light rail, Uber, some of parents drive, a select few drive themselves. That's a 3-year program. The Global Inclusive Program at Regis University is up in that kind of northwest corner of Denver. They do offer on-campus living for students who want it. Most do live on campus there, but not all. They're a bit unique in that they have a 1-year track, a 2-year track, a 3-year track, and a 4-year track. So students can really kind of pick how long they want to go to college and how in-depth they want their learning to be. And they have different types of certificates along the way, depending on how long they're there. And then University of Northern Colorado has the GOAL program in Greeley. Students are required to live on campus if they are GOAL students. All GOAL students live in the same dorm where they have really kind of intensive RA support and peer mentor support there as well. And that is a very traditional 4-year college experience. And then all four of these schools have what we call CTP certification. What does that mean practically for you as a family? It means the federal government will offer your students financial aid in the form of work study, right, and other kinds of grants like that. And it will also offer them like Pell Grants, that sort of thing. So work study and grants are the two main forms of federal financial aid. However, the federal government does not offer federal loans for students who are not seeking a degree. So that does not mean they can't get private loans, things like that. Certainly, there are lots of scholarships that can help, but no federal loans. And then all four of these schools offer that same certificate credential, which is called the Comprehensive Higher Education Certificate, or a check. That is a very, very weighty and a very meaningful outcome. It is not just a certificate of completion that you get for showing up on time to class every day. Students have transcripts, they have grades, they have to meet certain graduation requirements to earn that certificate at the end of their 3 or 4 years. It also can transfer between other schools that offer inclusive higher ed. So if a student starts at, let's say, ACC, they want to live at home for a few years, then maybe they decide, I'm ready to live on campus. I'm going to go to UNC. They can do that. They can take their credits from one school and transfer it to another school that also offers inclusive higher ed. CSU launched the RAM Scholars Program last August. They are really focused on agricultural learning and really preparing students for the jobs that are available up there in Larimer County, where it is much more rural, right? And the types of jobs that are open and available are different than they are in some of the cities, right? That is a 3-year program. They will eventually offer on-campus living, but as I said, this is only their second school year where the RAM Scholars Program has been officially launched. So when on-campus living comes, they still don't know. They don't want to bite off more than they can chew. They want to make sure they're doing academics well and doing everything else well first, but eventually that will come. MSU Denver has inclusive higher education solutions. That's right downtown on that Auraria campus, which is a commuter campus. So again, it's right on the light rail and the bus line. Some students Uber, things like that. That's a much more traditional 4-year college program. Lamar Community College in that bottom southeast corner of Colorado. Lamar, Colorado is a teeny tiny little town if you've never heard of it, but they have Cultivate. They, as a very, very rural school, do have on-campus living, which is unique for many community colleges. Students in Cultivate will be eligible for on-campus living, we think, in fall of 2027. Just like CSU, they don't want to start that yet. They want to make sure they're doing the rest of it right, but that should come in the next few years. And that's a 3-year option. And then lastly, Pikes Peak State College in Colorado Springs has Aspire Scholars, which is also a commuter campus. That's a 3-year program, I should say. And then all 4 of these schools have that CTP designation in progress. So as a reminder, that's that federal designation that allows students to get federal financial aid. So they'll have it eventually. They don't have it yet, but they will all graduate with that same comprehensive higher education certificate. All right, that was a lot. And I told you all that I was going to speak fast because we still have lots of content to go through. But what questions can I answer before we get too far? And you're welcome to unmute or use the chat. That's up to you. All right, I'm going to keep rolling, but if you have a question that comes in, I will pause. Okay, so let's talk about specific skills. And before we even do that, I like to just kind of give a little bit of framing, right? It's really important that we presume that students are competent and that we presume that students are capable. When we tell students that, yes, you can do greater things, they believe us and they prove us right. And when we tell them that, no, you can't do greater things, they believe us and they prove us right. So it's important to encourage students to be as informed as they want to be, as informed as they can, right? When we are thinking of what pathways do we offer to traditional high school students, right? What normative pathways do we offer? We may talk about trade schools, we may talk about college, we may talk about entering the workforce immediately, right? And we don't always offer all of those options directly to our students with disabilities. And I kind of wonder why not, right? So when we give students all of the information that they may need to make the right choice for them, they may decide that college is not right for them. And that certainly happens all the time. Or they might decide that college is right for them. So I always just like to say, this may seem like a lot, and this will be a lot. As I said, this webinar used to be an hour and a half instead of an hour. So I recognize this is very overwhelming, but it's important to give students the options and the skills and the knowledge, right? And so we'll talk about throughout this, what skills do they already have in certain domains that they can transfer to other domains to help them be prepared for college. And the reason why we do that is because, again, high expectations lead to positive outcomes. There was a study in 2015 that said teachers' expectations have a greater impact on a student becoming employed or going to college than a student's skills or disabilities, right? Expectations matter. So all of this is going to be about how do we give our students high expectations and help them get to where we know they can go. And I will also say before I start, this is going to be overwhelming. If you would like, and what I would encourage you to do is pick one or two areas that you really want to focus on. Or maybe it's just one or two bullet points from the entire presentation that you want to focus on, right? Start small. No one is expected to be able to know and do all of these things when they enter college, right? I had lots of deficits myself when I went to college, but we want to make sure that we give students as many skills as possible. And so I want to encourage you, pick the one or two that you think are going to be the most meaningful for where your student and where your family is right now. All right, so with that said, I am going to go through skills in the different domains of inclusive higher ed, and we are going to begin with academics. So something that we see a lot, particularly in students that go through transition after high school, but not always, sometimes we see it with all students, is that literacy skills are just less of a focus. So it's important to help students recognize a sentence and a paragraph structure, right? Starting with basic things like sentences begin with capital letters and they end with punctuation. Sentences have a subject and a verb, right? Even if we're just practicing really, really small sentences, that's going to be easier to build up into a paragraph. Because if you go to college and immediately you're told to write a whole paper, how do you write a whole paper if you don't even really know how to write a sentence, right? So it's important just to help start small, right? And focusing on sentence structure, focusing on paragraph structure. And I encourage even paragraphs of 3 sentences are great. Have a beginning, have a middle, have an end. That's a great starting place too. Note-taking of big ideas is a huge need in college, right? All college students need to be able to do that. So I encourage families, teachers, after a big conversation, just ask your student, hey, what did you get out of that? And then let's practice that sentence structure that we're learning, right? And we can maybe write that down. How do we write down the 1 or 2 sentences that we took away from that conversation? And we can really guide them of like, hey, I don't think that's what I took out of that conversation. What I took is this thing. Tell me why you didn't hear that, right? And we can really kind of dig into that together and have conversations about what are each of our understandings. Email etiquette is so important in college. This is going to be the main way that our students interact with particularly their professors, but sometimes also their peer mentors too. Lots of students go to college and they've never really had to email before, and they treat email like text, where they'll shoot off like one email has one sentence and it's multiple emails in a row, right? So really practicing how can we have one email that has multiple bullet points in it, right? Or even basic things. Let's start with what do you put in the to line? What do you put in the subject line? How do you sign off an email, right? And so one way that I encourage students to work on this skill is it could be at the end of every class period or it could be at the end of every day. Send an email to their parents, to their teachers saying, this is everything I did in my day. And it could be, if it's at the end of a class period, it's I just finished science. We talked about the chemical structure of an atom. I'm making this up, right? And my homework is page 26 of my workbook. And then maybe they send another one after social studies and another one after gym. Or it could be one big email. Here's everything I remember doing in my day. That also helps with that note taking of big ideas as well. Audiobooks are so important. We know there's lots and lots of reading in college, and it's a lot. Like I remember being overwhelmed by the amount of reading I had when I was in college too. So for a student who maybe doesn't have the greatest literacy skills, that would be even more challenging. So I really encourage families to help students with audiobooks, even if you're starting, and maybe even especially if you're starting with audiobooks of just books they've already read and love, right? Maybe you're doing an audiobook of a chapter book or sorry, a picture book. Maybe you're doing an audiobook of Harry Potter, right? Just get used to taking in information auditorily. And then when they get to college, that's not a brand new thing they're having to do for the first time. In terms of self-advocacy, it's so necessary for students to know their own learning needs. One of the first things I shared at the start of this webinar is that students have to go to professors and tell them what their accommodations and modifications are. So if students don't know their own strengths and weaknesses, or they don't know their own interests, right? That's going to be really hard to have those conversations on the first day of class, or even before that, during the formation of those accommodations and modifications. How are we going to know what accommodations or modifications you need if you can't tell me what you're good at or where you need support. And then in terms of technology, technology is huge on college campuses for any student, every student, right? Pretty much nothing is done on paper anymore. You're going to be hard pressed to find a student who prints out their assignments and staples it together and hands it to the professor, right? Almost everything is done digitally. So with that said, as I already mentioned, email etiquette is really important, but so is email access. Lots of students don't necessarily know how to log into an email. Maybe they don't have an email to log into, or if they do, maybe they don't get a lot of emails, so there's no sense in checking it, right? So if your student doesn't have an email address, either through school or a personal one, I would recommend creating one. And then you could start that practice of sending those, it could be daily, it could be weekly emails to the families and to the teachers. And then maybe as the parent, you respond every single day. Thank you so much for letting me know what happened in science class today. I will help you with your homework when you get home. Right? It's hard to get students in the habit of checking an email if they don't have anything in that inbox. So help them with that. And then Office software, and then LMS is the learning management system. So lots and lots of students, even in high school, even if the whole class is doing their assignment on the computer, if you have a student who has a modification that maybe technology is just really hard, and so maybe the teacher prints out their assignment and then just accepts the paper version, that's probably not going to happen very much in college. They're going to have to figure out how to use Google Docs or Microsoft Word. They're going to have to figure out how to turn in their assignments online. And it's probably going to be a different LMS in college than in high school, but just getting used to the process and the habit of doing it can go a long way. So I even encourage teachers to have like a discussion board online of like every Monday you just put in, what did you do this weekend? Where students have to just respond to the discussion board digitally, right? And then you can slowly work your way up from there. And then again, lots of assistive technology. There's audiobooks. If you're not familiar with Read and Write, that is a free plugin that Google Chrome offers where it can turn any web page. It can do speech or text to speech of any web page, and then on any Google page, so like Google Docs, Gmail, Google Search, you can do speech to text as well. So that's a great feature. If you haven't worked with it or your student hasn't worked with it, I would recommend just downloading it and practicing it. Again, they may use different assistive technology in college, but at least getting used to something is a great, great starting place. It's also important for students to explore their academic interests so they know what courses they want to take when they get to college. Attendance and punctuality is huge. If students don't show up to class on time because they decided they'd rather sleep in than go to their first class of the day, that's going to be an issue in college, right? So really practicing time management and getting places on time is super important. Inclusive participation is the name of the game in college. When they have a group project, they are going to be working with the traditional college students in those classes. When they go to clubs on campus, they're going to be doing it with all of the other students on campus too, right? So I encourage you, if you don't already, to encourage your students' teachers to have inclusive participation in those academic settings already. Now, this is a big one. Responsibility and ownership for high quality work is something that not all of our students are held to in high school. Lots of our students are just sort of given like a participation grade. Thanks so much for turning something in, go do something else kind of thing, right? That doesn't fly in college. Students do have, as I said, weighty grades that go on their transcript that will have to meet their graduation requirements if they want to get that certificate at the end of their time. So I always encourage students to look back at their work and really ask themselves, is this something I'm proud of? Is this something I want to turn in? Is this something that I think is worthy of a high grade? And I always encourage them, at least find one thing that you think you can improve. There's always one thing that you can improve. Maybe you start with one, and then you work your way to two, and then you work your way to three, right? Because the onus is on students to turn in their very, very best work. Goal setting and tracking is a huge one, right? Especially for students who have extended deadlines. So their website online on their LMS may say it's due Tuesday, but maybe for me it's due Friday. Well, I'm the one who has to track that, right? That it's due Friday and not Tuesday. So I encourage students to use either a physical planner, right? Like paper and pencil planner, if that works best, or use their phones to really track deadlines and break apart. Even sometimes it can help to like, okay, well, if the whole thing is due Friday, then maybe by Monday I want this part done. And by Tuesday I want this part done, right? And having students track their progress on their own. Following a schedule can be super important, and it's often hard to practice this one in high school because the schedule is already created for you, right? You're already told from first period you go to second period, from there you go to lunch, right? And that's not necessarily the case in college, where everyone's schedules are all different and everyone's all over campus and it's a bit more helter-skelter. So one thing that can help with this is having students figure out their whole schedule for their whole day, even outside of school, right? So it can start with I wake up at 7 in the morning. At 7:10, I take a shower. At 7:30, I'm downstairs for breakfast, right? And figuring out their schedule even outside of classes can then help with that broader scheduling piece once the academic classes and things do come into play in college. Now, a big one is constructive criticism. It's really hard to learn what to do with constructive criticism if you've never received it before. And so I really encourage families and teachers to provide constructive criticism where necessary, right? I'm not saying you should overly criticize your kid where they don't deserve it. But when they do, I think it's really important to have conversations about, like, hey, maybe that wasn't the best choice or that wasn't the best approach. What could we do differently? And turn it more into a conversation. And then eventually it can kind of snowball from there, where it's a bit more of the type of criticism that students might get from a college professor or from a peer or things like that. And then a huge one is persistence and having a growth mindset. The number one thing I hear from students who go to college, particularly in their first semester, is there is so much homework in college, and it takes a lot of patience to sit down and get all this stuff done. And that's true of all college students, right? But even more for students who maybe are not used to a traditional homework load. So I encourage you to find ways in your students or your child's life to figure out where can they work on a little bit more persistence, where can they work on some of that growth mindset, so that's not a brand new muscle that they're flexing when they get to college. In terms of social, some skills that they will need, a major, major, major one is self-awareness and regulation. There are certain behaviors that just don't fly on a college campus, right? So if we get overwhelmed, what's an appropriate way to handle that overwhelm? Is it appropriate to scream and run around campus? Probably is going to be less appropriate at the college level, right? And so figuring out what are some of those coping techniques that we can work on with students now can go a long way. Schedule management, as I already mentioned, can also bleed into the social piece when students are figuring out, like, hey, I've got a huge 3-hour block between these two classes. Maybe I want to go meet my friend at the dining hall at 12 o'clock, right? Well, who's going to remind you to do that? Nobody. So I encourage the use of everybody in college, they live and die by their calendars. I encourage using those cell phone calendars to your students' benefit and really trying to figure out how can they manage their own personal schedules and things like that starting now. Professional relationship awareness. We'll talk about that again in the career section, but I think it's worth putting in social too, because it's important to start working with students to figure out how do we interact with our boss that's different than how we interact with our best friend, right? And for some of us, that's a really easy thing that we just know. Those are two different relationships. I treat those people differently. And for some of us, that's less obvious. And so using kind of just different times to point out, and it may look differently for who your student is, right? But even like how do you interact with your teachers can be a good way to get into that, like how do you interact with coworkers kind of conversation. Personal needs communication and self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is going to fall in all 4 of these pillars because it really does matter everywhere. If students are not able to say, hey, I'm overwhelmed right now, I need to take a break, or I need to XYZ, no one's going to do that for them. That goes along with conflict management or relationship management. This tends to be one that we see more in students who live on campus, but it does exist for everyone, right? You're never going to escape conflict, but particularly for students who have roommates, this is a big one. And so if you have maybe multiple kids and you're used to like the sibling conflict, maybe as a parent you're really used to stepping in, I would encourage you to not. Just kind of let it be. Or work with your student to figure out, hey, you did this. Maybe next time we can try this other path, right? And try to help get them steps to independence of some of that conflict management skill. Collaboration and active participation is huge. No one is going to force them to go to various clubs or be active on campus, right? So helping them figure out what do they want to do? What do they feel comfortable participating in actively and inclusively? Adaptability is a major one. This could also fall under academics too, because we have lots of professors who might send an email saying class that's supposed to be in 10 minutes is actually canceled today, right? But this can also happen when we have plans with friends that fall through or work schedules change, things like that. And so for a lot of us, we're really used to having pretty rigid schedules because we know that maybe our students are not the most adaptable, and it's easier to just make our schedule as rigid and as predictable as possible. And I would encourage you, if that has been your um, maybe your history in your family, and that's perfectly understandable, I would encourage you to find ways to increase the need for adaptability in your family so that, again, that's not a brand new skill. And then I always have to give this caveat that your students are going to be on a college campus with all of the things that are available to other students on a college campus too. And we want students to know how to take risks responsibly before they're put in situations where they're making risks irresponsibly, right? And so this can be even laying out scenarios and figuring out what would you do in the situation? Or it could be encouraging students to take risks now while you're there and you can support them and you're there to kind of catch them, right? But we know that risk taking is important and we want to encourage students to take risks. We just want to make sure that they're doing it well and intelligently, right? Some of that goes along with social media. Lots and lots of students use social media in a variety of different ways. Some use it more appropriately, some use it less appropriately. We want to encourage students to kind of fall on that one side of that spectrum. So that could even be talking to students about how do you use social media? When you get a friend request from someone that you have never met before, should you accept it? Right? Talking to students about how not everybody online is a good person or not everybody online is a friend, not everybody online, even if they are a friend, need to see everything that maybe is in our head that we think we should put on social media. That can be a really important conversation to have early and to have often. And modeling is a great way to go about that. And then lastly, natural supports. If your student gets lost on their college campus, they could, I guess, call mom or dad, but if mom or dad didn't go to college there, they're probably not going to be a great resource to help them figure out where to go. So who would they go to? They might go to the welcome desk. They might ask another student on campus. Maybe they would ask a peer mentor, right? So who are some natural supports that your student can go to now before they turn to you? And encourage them to try those things before they have mom or dad or teacher step in. In terms of career, it's so important that you chat with your student about what careers they want and you can do some career exploration with them. But it's going to be really hard when they get on their college campus for the first semester, and they are trying to figure out their class schedule, which is all in line with their career goal, if they don't even know what careers are out there, right? So I really encourage you to take your student to job shadows or volunteering or all kinds of different things so that you can explore a variety of options so that they know what's out there. Self-awareness is also a huge part of that. It's important for students to know what they're good at and what they like. I've had lots of students say to me things like, I want to be a teacher. And I've said, oh, you really like kids? And they go, no, I hate kids. And I'm thinking to myself, that's probably not a student with great self-awareness about what they will probably need in a career, right? That could also be a student that they've not had great career exploration, so they don't really know what's out there. And so I encourage you to work with your students to figure out what's a good fit for them. And that might be a terrible fit for your other kid or for you, right? But what is it that they want to do for the rest of their life? Time management is a huge piece. We know, especially for students who have maybe not always had the greatest stamina in the classroom, that can kind of roll over into the workplace too. So when we think about like a task that a student might get, maybe they're in an internship in college and their boss says, hey, we have these packets, we need them to be stapled. We have 10 packets, you need to staple these packets, right? How do you teach your student that maybe you staple all 10 packets and then you give yourself a break? Rather than I stapled one packet, now I get a break. Then I staple another packet and now I get another break, right? That's not great time management. That's probably not a boss that's going to want to hire that student back for another internship next semester. So really working on delaying rewards and delaying gratification can go a long way. Communication strategies is also super, super important. How do you communicate, as I already mentioned in the last slide, with your boss differently than you communicate with your friend? That can also be like, how do you tell your boss that you're sick and you're not coming into work today, right? That can take a variety um, of forms. Problem solving. I'm going to stick with my stapler example from the time management. Maybe I'm stapling these packets and my stapler runs out of staples. How do I figure out where to get more staples, right? Maybe I'm using some of those natural supports and I'm going to other people in the job place and I'm asking them, where do you keep your office supplies? Or maybe I decide I'm going to look around and I'm going to see where are other office supplies kept. Maybe there are staples there, right? So thinking about some natural problem solving skills can go a long way in the workplace as well. Motivation and initiative, some of that kind of goes with that time management piece that I already mentioned, right? But staying motivated to keep tasks going for an extended period of time can be something that students need to know. Self-advocacy kind of goes along with that self-awareness, but also it goes along with saying to a boss, like, hey, I really need a seat. That's an appropriate accommodation I need for my disability. I need a chair, right? Basic things like that. Social emotional understanding. What happens when we get upset in the workplace? What's an appropriate way to handle that? And so some of these things, I hope you're kind of starting to see that some of these things from the various categories do kind of fit together. And you can work on some of these skills in ways that do transfer. Coping techniques, as I already mentioned, kind of goes along with that as well. All right, in terms of independence, students will be navigating campus all by themselves. They may probably will have a peer mentor figuring out the first few weeks to get them from their dorm to their class. But maybe like 2 weeks in, the peer mentor will say, you know what, I'm going to meet you right at the library. I'll see you there. You got to get your way from your dorm to the library or from your dorm to class, right? Or to the dining hall, right? We all got to eat. So we're all going to have to figure out how to navigate campus independently. That's super easy when you talk to seniors. They can do that with their eyes closed. For first and second week freshmen, that is like deer in headlights. I have no idea where the heck I'm going and how am I ever going to figure this out? So I encourage, especially if you have a student who typically has like a paraprofessional walk with them from class to class, I encourage you to figure out a way to get your student to go from this class to the next class by themselves. Maybe that means they're leaving class like 5 minutes early so that they're not in the huge rush of the hallway. And maybe that means a para is still going with them, but they're like 20 feet behind. So they're not right next to them, not directly showing them the way, right? But figure out how can we navigate this place that we know on our own. Personal and campus safety, hugely, hugely important. We should not be walking around campus with an open backpack with our laptop and wallet sticking right out, right? And so we can practice a lot of these things out in the community. Do we have a bag to put our cell phone, our wallet, that kind of stuff in? What kind of bag? Is it a big bag that anyone could just reach in and grab, or is it one with a zipper, right? And so even just figuring out how can we incorporate some of these more like common sense techniques all across a student's day and life is a great way to practice that skill. Community access and travel, particularly if you have a student who is going to be commuting to campus, you can start figuring out some travel training with them or looking at maps. In college, we have so much downtime. So if I have 3 hours between class, should I spend all 3 hours scrolling through TikTok? Or should I maybe do some homework? Maybe I should go to the dining hall and get some lunch. Maybe I should go to office hours, right? So especially during like summer break, weekends, those tend to be when students have the most downtime. Those are great times to help your students figure out how to use that time constructively. Medication management, this doesn't apply to everybody. Some students have more complicated medical needs than others, but certainly you can always start by like take a vitamin every day and then you can slowly graduate up from there, right? But start pretty low stakes. You can start by setting timers on students' phones so they know when their medications have to be taken and which ones. That can help a lot. Self-care and cleanliness. We have lots and lots and lots of parents who report back, I should say, parents of college students who report back that their students are maybe not showering as often as mom and dad would like them to. So I would encourage you to help your students get into those habits now. And again, use those cell phone reminders and timers, right? Maybe you're setting a timer for every single day or every other day, right? To take a shower. Maybe once a week, we're setting a reminder to strip our sheets. Maybe it's once a week that we're setting a timer to do daily chores around the house, right? Like sweeping, mopping, things like that. But I would, again, start small and then work your way up to help your student figure out how they can become as independent as possible with their self-care. We'll talk about interagency supports as we keep going through these slides. Money management is one that lots of parents tell me they're very, very afraid of because they know if they give their child a debit card, it's going to go down to zero in like 2 seconds because their student may not really understand money at all. That's very common. So I encourage you to start with cash. It might be that, hey, here's 20 bucks. We're going to go to the grocery store. Let's together figure out how are we going to spend this $20 appropriately. And then maybe you slowly graduate to like a Visa gift card. So there's still only so much money on it, right? That way they're not walking onto a college campus with a debit card on the first day, which they will all have to have a debit card with them on a college campus. That's a requirement. They're going to have access to money. They're going to need to know how to use that appropriately, right? So start small. Start by talking about like how are we using this money appropriately? Should I, if I only have $20, should I spend all $20 on one t-shirt, or should I maybe go to the grocery store and get some food for lunch, right? What's more appropriate use of that money? Home-based responsibilities, I already kind of talked about with the sweeping, mopping, chores, things like that. But again, if students are living on campus, they're going to be doing those things pretty independently. Again, I know I've been speaking quickly, so what questions can I answer? You can unmute or put in the chat.
Do you have experience with people putting these kinds of things into IEPs during the high
Sometimes.
school years?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a few slides. I have a lot of IEP resources. That is more common for students who are already in transition than it is for students in high school, but it can happen, certainly. And I would encourage you to chat at your students' next IEP meeting about what's appropriate, what fits in with goals they already have, and then what new goals do we want to create. And that's certainly appropriate.
That actually leads me to another question about in transition. So we're in rural Colorado on the Western Slope, so we don't have a transition program. Is that a requirement at all to be able to go into college?
Absolutely not. No. So there's kind of no best path. Some students go right from 12th grade and then the very next year they go to college. Some students will graduate and then wait 5 years and then go to college. Some will start transition but not finish it. Some will finish it. It's really kind of wherever your student's at. There's no requirements in any sense like that.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions before we try to tackle the remaining in the next 8 minutes? All right. If you put anything in the chat, I will do my best to get to it, but let's keep rolling. Okay, so I kind of talked about some of this as I was going through that last portion, but I do encourage you again, have a specific plan of implementation. That may mean, as we just talked about, putting certain goals in an IEP. That may mean you're figuring out what one or two things are you going to really work on with your student this year. And maybe that's a whole skill category. Maybe that's literally one or two skills, right? Figure out where your student is, meet them where they're at. Don't bite off more than you can chew, but there are certainly things you can start doing now. So here are some general things that we can do that are not really certain category related. A growth mindset is so important. As I've said a few times, lots of students come back after their first week, first semester, first year and say, oh my gosh, college is so much harder than high school. I said that when I was in college too, right? That's just natural. And so it's important to keep students going, right? How can they keep that motivation? They know they can do it. They know they can get there and they can withstand some of those challenges. Creating an environment of choice is so necessary because they're going to have lots more choice in college than they've ever had before. So we can start with choices as simple as like, what do we want for dinner? Or should we wear like green or blue to school today, right? Lots of our students maybe already choose their own outfits, but maybe yours doesn't, right? So figuring out as many places where you can provide choice in a reasonable fashion as possible is great. Otherwise, they get to college and they're oftentimes overwhelmed by the amount of choice they have. And then they get a little bit of anxiety and they might freeze. They don't know how to maybe make some of these choices just because there's too many choices to make. It's important to fade supports over time so that as students get to college, they are as independent as possible, right? If mom and dad are doing everything for students until the day they're dropped off at college and now mom and dad aren't there to do any of it, uh-oh, right? So we got to practice fading some of those supports in an appropriate fashion. We might want to use prompts that are the least intrusive, and then slowly work our way up to prompts that are more intrusive as students need them. So that might look like an open-ended question, like, hey, what's a time where you blank, right? Maybe they can't come up with one. So then you say something to recall background information. How about that time when you went to the Rockies game, right? Something like that, where you're just saying like something small to get them to recall maybe something. And if they're still not coming up with anything, then you can have some direct cues or some specific reminders to natural information, right? But start with as few prompts as possible to try to get students to kind of think of their own experiences, memories, things like that on their own. And then, as we already talked about, risk is really important. There's a dignity in being allowed to make a risk. It's just in how do we do those responsibly, right? And so that is really important in giving students a platform to make risks in ways that are appropriate. Okay, there's lots and lots of things. We only have 4 minutes, so I'm going to speed through these. But as I mentioned, you will get this slideshow tomorrow, so you can look through these on your own at home as well. You can always reach out to me for additional questions after. But, oh, I just clicked something that I did not intend to click. All right, here we go. So there are financial resources on our website. If you want to start looking at those with your students, that can be a great way to at least start the conversation about, hey, college costs money, and how are we going to help pay for it? How are you going to help pay for it, right? That can be a great way to start some of those money management conversations. If you don't have a specific calendar tracking app, or you don't like the one that comes on your phone, I would figure out one that you like, that your student likes, and put all of their appointments in there. I would even put in like, first period is this, second period is this, right? So that they're used to things popping up on that app, because in college, that is going to be how they find their way from work to class 1 to soccer practice to whatever. As I already mentioned, vitamins are a great way to start with a medication management. It's so important for students to know how to make, like, even if it's 1 or 2 meals, maybe they're just learning how to boil water for pasta and make a quesadilla in the microwave, right? It's nice for students to have at least 1 or 2 staple meals that they can make when they are living on their own. And it's important for students to know how to pack their own backpack. If your student isn't already doing that, I would encourage them to begin that now, because guess who's going to be packing their backpack every single day when they go to college? They are. And so start that early. And then again, we can have cleaning routines where we can put that, maybe it's in our phone, or maybe it's a big wall poster in the kitchen or something, where we're really teaching students, how do you identify moldy food? How do you clean a tub, right? Things like that can go a long way. At school, students should start leading their own IEP meetings. They might be there, but if they're not the leader of it, this is a great time for them to practice their self-advocacy and sharing their skills and their needs. If your student is not already in inclusive classrooms or inclusive extracurriculars, that's a great thing to do. Research shows that that goes a long way in preparing students for college and preparing students for the workplace. If you don't know how to interact in an inclusive setting, of course you're not going to know how to interact in an inclusive setting when it happens for the first time, right? So let's get that happening as early and as often as possible. It's so common for teachers and sometimes even paraprofessionals who mean really well to just say like, hey, good job, you did it, let's move on. We really need to have high expectations, because in college, that's the name of the game. If you are ever emailing a teacher or a case manager or a sports coach or anybody about your student, CC them into that email. We like to say nothing about us without us, right? There should be no conversation about a student happening that they are not privy to. And in college, that will not happen. They will be part of every single conversation. So let's get them used to that. We can meet with teachers, paraeducators, as early and as often throughout the school year as needed for students to talk about what accommodations and modifications are going well, what they need, that kind of thing, where again, they're having those self-advocacy conversations. Select classes and extracurriculars that interest students, because that is going to be all they do in college. And then it's important to offer time for students to organize their backpack, their locker, to check their email, right? It's easy enough to say like, hey, you didn't check your email today, buddy, but did you give them time to do that? So I encourage teachers and parents sometimes after school to try to incorporate that into the daily schedule. I know we're at 6 o'clock, so if you need to go, please do. I only have about 2 more minutes, so if you want to hang out, that is great. Out in the community, I encourage students to begin volunteering in an area that interests them so that they know what kinds of jobs they like or what kind of community engagement are they interested, that sort of thing. So job shadowing, internships, those can all go a really, really long way. If you have not already, I would start working with your student to not only talk about what activities, extracurriculars, things interest them, but have them be part of the registration process so that they know what that looks like. Accessing travel training is typically part of the college curriculum, but it depends where students go. It isn't always. And there are lots of free travel training programs, particularly across the Denver metro area, but also some in the rural parts of the state as well. And then again, practicing natural supports. Mom and dad are not always going to be there. Brother and sister are not always going to be there. So I would say go to the grocery store, give them a list of like 3 things. If they don't know where they are, who do they ask? Right? If I'm at the grocery store and I'm looking for soup, I find a person who works at the grocery store and I say, what aisle is the soup in? And you can help your student do that too, right? So that asking strangers for things like that is not a totally foreign activity. And then if you have not already, I highly encourage you to connect to your local case management agency. Someone in the registration did ask a question. Does it matter what waiver you're on to go to college? No, waivers don't matter in terms of college acceptance. They may matter in terms of what kinds of financial support your student is eligible for. But if you don't even know what I'm talking about when I'm saying the word waiver, please get in contact with your case management agency now. All right, and then just as a last reminder, you're not alone. I know this is so overwhelming. Hopefully you can think of a team of teachers, other people in your family, all kinds of people that you can work with to help make these things happen and take it one step at a time. As I already mentioned, it's okay and it's recommended to just pick 1 or 2 things to start with, right? Start small and then collaborate with community agencies like DVR and SWAP, like you maybe have a local chapter of the ARC, or as I already said in the last slide, case management agencies. There are lots of people out there to help you to help chip away at some of these skills and provide your students with as many supports as possible. All right, and then this is not things I need to talk to you about. This is just when you get the slideshow, you can download all of these things. If you just click them, you get lots and lots of handouts, lots of links, all kinds of things, IEP goals. If you want to take those into your next IEP meeting, lots of things. With that said, thank you for giving me 2 extra minutes of your evening. I am going to stop recording